I looked this week to find out what the most popular shows on streaming services are right now. And what was fascinating as I looked at the different shows is out of the top 10, 7 or 8 of them all had a recurring theme. Whether they were stories about presidents or politics or the CEO of an entertainment product or a large corporation or a violent justice vigilante or a superhero or a law firm or whatever it was, the common theme was these were all stories of power. Power, people who had power and lost it, people who didn't have power, who were trying to get power, people who were hurt by power and then went and hurt the powers that hurt them. This evaluation of whether money is power or title is power or opportunity is power or education is power, and the struggles and who we are as we are watching these shows, rooting to have more power or less power or for the power to change hands. One of the reasons that I think this is so common for us as we watch these shows, and we may not even realize, oh, these are all actually stories of power, whatever the genre of show or film it is, as one person said, art imitates life. And to some degree, we are watching art and these stories of power because they reflect back the fact that we have our own stories of power in real life. Whether those stories are about political leaders or who we voted for or being in nation or with nations in our own country or around the world where we are watching struggles for power or thinking about what that means for us in our everyday lives. Whether that's about the opportunity or influence or wealth that we have or don't have or we're trying to get more of, perhaps in our place of work. Whether that's about the dynamics of popularity and influence within our friend group and who seems to have more popularity or more voice or more influence, or perhaps as we're trying to grow our business or just our personal presence on our social platform and likes and subscriptions and reposts, and all of that has to do with some of that influence. And these are all stories of power in one sense and our own struggle with it. We may not think about it that way, and in one sense, it's not inherently an evil thing, but as we seek to get more of a voice or more stability or more influence or grow something or be someone or build a career or chart a path, in a sense, it brings us into a wrestle with power, and even within our workplaces and our goals. The truth is we have a complicated relationship with it. In one sense, we are drawn to power. In other senses, we are repelled by it or repulsed by it. In some ways, we are envious of power or those who have it, or we are suspicious of those who have it. We dream about having more, maybe, or we have nightmares about power and power struggles. This is just the reality of our lives. And I bring it up today, in part in church and in part in where we are in the season of Lent, because in one respect or another, the cross or Christian spirituality says and uses language like this, that the cross is a symbol or a story of power. But the question is, well, what kind of power is it? I mean, actually, if you look back in Christian history, it's not a very good story of power. Even the story of the Emperor Constantine, who eventually made Christianity the official religion of the empire in the mid-4th century, did so apparently because as he was jostling with other military leaders in the Roman Empire for power, apparently he had, on the eve of some great battle he was going to have to fight in order to become emperor, he had a dream of Jesus, and so he thought what he would do is put a cross on a white cross on the shields of all of his military. And he did that, and they marched on against their enemies, and they destroyed them. And he believed, oh, it was the cross that gave me that victory. It was the cross that gave me power. And so now, in a sense, history says, well, it was part of the reason he made Christianity the official religion of the empire, because he felt like it was power that gave him the power to kill and to win. And of course, many of us can read about or perhaps have lived through ways in which the cross has been used by churches and religions, in one sense, as a symbol of power, or those hid behind the cross as protection from justice, or as hiding from owning things that they had done that were really abuses of power. And to some degree, sometimes some of us wear it or grew up with it hanging on a wall in our house or whatever, is that is somehow kind of a good luck charm symbol of power. Like if I have this, or I tattoo it on me, or I hold it around my neck, that somehow I'll have more advantage or blessing or whatever. It is, in one sense, a story of power. And so we have to recognize that even though, in a sense, we might say the cross has power, it begs the question, what kind of story of power is the story of the cross? I'm bringing it up specifically today because we're not just in the season of Lent, the 40 days plus 7 Sundays season that the church around the world takes to look deeply into the death, the suffering and death of Jesus, of course, on a cross. But we are actually talking through these weeks in a series that we've called Jesus Died, Big Deal. It is a big deal, but we want to know how and why. How is one man's death on a cross 2,000 years ago something that has changed and brought life to everyone? And what does it mean for your life and mine personally? And why is this such a big thing? And why, the more I understand it, the more I understand myself and my own story, and perhaps even for today, my own story with power. What I thought I would do for you, just to, in a sense, tell you the real story of power, of the power of the cross. I want to read it for you like it's a children's story. Not because it's childish or fictitious, but because I think for some of us who are maybe very familiar with the cross, the story of the cross, with Easter, with Lent, for those of you saying, yes, this is a very important symbol in my life. Jesus himself is the leader and Lord of my life. Sometimes our familiarity with it can make us miss what story Jesus was telling, especially as it relates to the story of the power of the cross. And perhaps for those of you that have, something about that, or you associate the cross with Jesus or whatever, but you're not quite sure, well, what is exactly the story? So I want to invite you to listen to it, and I've kind of written it, and don't at me about the stuff I left out, because I'm not telling the entire story. I'm telling this story specifically of the power of the cross. And so I'd invite you to listen now as I read it. A long time ago, in a land far away from here, there lived a group of people. They lived in their hometowns and in their own land, but things were not good or safe for them. Their lives were controlled by a very powerful emperor and his very powerful army. Their taxes were so high that they could barely afford to live. Many of them had their land or businesses or lives taken away because they couldn't pay their taxes. The emperor gave them their own king, but everyone knew he was a puppet king. He was paid off by the emperor, and he was in it for himself. Life was hard and hopeless. Some of the older people would sometimes talk about the old stories when God would act powerfully to help them and save them and protect them. But those stories seemed a long way off, and so did God. Life actually felt godless and powerless. Yet, every so often, someone would quote an ancient prophecy or sing an ancient song that talked about a someday, one day king who would come and save his people. And actually, every so often, someone would come along claiming to be that king. It happened a few times. And they would build a following and recruit an army and march into Jerusalem, the capital city, to take the Romans. Fight power with power, they would say. The sword with the sword, they would say. Blood for blood, they would say. But those kings had little success. Eventually, they would be executed by Rome. A lot of people would die fighting for them, then try to keep the revolution alive for a while until more were killed and the rest gave up. No one seemed powerful enough to defeat Rome and return their lives and their land and their faith to them. And just when it seemed like they were doomed to live in powerlessness forever, something happened. Another person came along. He actually wasn't claiming to be king, but little by little, the whispers and excitement of the people around him kind of suggested that he could be king, that he could be the king. He had all the ingredients. He had a powerful following. Crowds and crowds of people were always flocking to him. They hung on his every word because he had powerful words. He had an authority and a voice people would follow, and he didn't seem to be anyone's puppet. And he literally had power. He could do miracles, heal sicknesses. A couple of times, he even brought dead people back to life. At a certain point, everyone noticed how powerful he was. The people, the religious leaders, Herod, the puppet king, and even Rome. He would never come out and say that he was the king, but after a while, no one needed him to say it. Everyone knew it. And then, the moment they were waiting for, he decided to go to Jerusalem. He actually planned the whole thing out. He got his friends to get him a donkey so he could ride into the city like the other kings of old. Hundreds of people came to cheer him on because they knew exactly what he was doing. This is what all the past so-called kings had done, but this time it seemed different. He had far more power than any of them had ever possessed. He arrived in the city and he went straight to the temple because the temple was the center of where everything happened. He made a big speech about how God wasn't happy with what was happening there. He even threw around some tables and wrecked some things. He was definitely making a statement, flexing some muscles. Things needed to change, he said. The whole city was buzzing about this man. He was unlike anyone they had ever met. They had never seen or heard this kind of power from any ordinary human. The kind that could start a revolution that would actually work. And then, just when their hopes were so high, everything fell apart. One of his best friends told his enemies where he was, and they came to arrest him at night. The rest of his best friends ran away because they were afraid of getting arrested too. His enemies brought him to a trial with all the religious leaders, and they asked him, "Are you the chosen one by God to be our king?" And for the first time, and the worst time to say it, he said, "Yes, I am." And they hated him for it because they were jealous and they did not want him to be their king. They were going to lose their power because of him. So they convicted him of sinning and said that he had to die. Then they spit on him and they hit him. Then they took him to King Herod, the puppet king. He and his soldiers said, "Hey, do some tricks for us, magic man." And he wouldn't. So they made fun of him, humiliated him, and then put a robe on him, pretending he was the king. Then Herod sent him to the Roman governor, Pilate. Pilate also asked him if he was a king. If he was, Rome would have to kill him, because of course there was no king allowed except the emperor. Again, Jesus chose the worst moment to say yes, but that's what he did. So Pilate ordered him to be crucified. Then Pilate's soldiers did something terrible. Since he said he was a king, they made a crown for him. But it was a painful one, full of thorns. They pressed it onto his head, put a tree branch in his hand, and then bowed down to him, pretending he was their king. And then to show him that he wasn't, they beat him up pretty bad. And then they executed him on a cross. The power of the crowds was gone. The power of his words were gone. He said nothing. And he did no miracles. He just died. Friends, that is the story of the power of the cross. And for any honest reader, it's a terrible story. It has a terrible ending. It's a beautiful mounting story that falls off a cliff, an ending no one expected, and an ending nobody wanted. Everyone watching would have thought, what a waste. What a disappointment. Some of his own friends even later on said, our hopes were crushed. We thought he was going to deliver us from the Romans, but clearly we thought wrong. They thought it was a terrible ending, an unexpected one, and a total waste. But all along, he had been telling them this story of power, not about the cross, but in everything else that he said, because he was trying to tell them that he was a king, but not a king like any they had known or understood or even wanted. He was the king of an upside down kingdom. Because he said things like, consider yourself blessed if you're poor or weak or weeping or persecuted. He said things like, it's better to give than to get. He said, the first will be last and the last will be first. He was describing the upside down kingdom. And he says this, anyone who tries to hang on to their life will lose it, but whoever loses it will find it. All along, he had been telling them this upside down story of power. And in fact, not just what he said, but how he lived. It should have seen the clues. He seemed to be the least interested in people with power and wealth and influence. In that culture, and of course, if he was trying to build his power and build an army, he would trade power for power. I'll give you this and you will help me later, or you will support my ministry, or you will build into this. You will lend me your power as I give you mine. And yet he seemed to be uninterested in amassing the power and the wealth and the influence and title of people around him. In fact, he helped all the people who had no power to give him so that when he needed something, they would have nothing to give. All the way along, Jesus was telling them this alternate, upside-down story of power, but they couldn't see it. And yet, his death on the cross was not actually an experience of his powerlessness, but in fact, his deliberate choice to use all the power he had like that. In a sense, to give it away. A couple of years later, the Apostle Paul would write a letter to a church in a place called Philippi describing this experience of Jesus. And he quoted in his letter this song, this hymn that they had started to write about Jesus, specifically about this. It was a hymn or a song of a story of power. And listen to what he quotes, the lyrics from the song. I'm not going to sing it for you because I don't know what the tune was. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on the cross. They were singing about this story of the upside down kingdom and this upside down view of power. He had it, they said, with God, equal with God, but he gave it away. He had all of the privileges that come with power, but he emptied himself of them and took on a life without privilege. And then it says this, that he humbled himself. Yes, the cross was something that others used power to do to him, and yet it seemed like he deliberately chose it. Why, of all the times when people said, are you the Messiah? Are you the king? He said, no, 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 until the 2 times he should not have said it, and that's when he said it. Why else except that he was trying to die? He was deliberately choosing to humble himself because he was writing a new story of power for the human race. Now, any of you that know this story would say, hey, kids, don't worry. The pastor only told you half the story. He told you the sad, depressing part. There is actually an end, the resurrection. 3 days later, he came back to life. That was his power. The cross was weakness, but then the resurrection was power. He came back to life. Boom, he wins. It's the story of power. Don't be sad. And is that what the resurrection is? I mean, you're right. That is what happened. But Jesus does not use the resurrection as a power play. He simply doesn't. I mean, here's the thing, I was thinking about it. If this was my story, and I was Jesus in that story, and I was killed, and then I had resurrection power, and I came back to life, I got a list of people I'm gonna see first. You know what I'm going to first? I'm going to Caiaphas' house, the high priest. You know what I'm going? In the middle of the night. Because that's when he dragged me into his house for this pretend trial where they threw all these false accusations on me and then hit me and spit at me and condemned me to die. So I'm going to go in the middle of the night and I'm going to knock on his door. I think I'll put my torch right at my chin, so the face will be lit up. And I'll knock on the door and he'll open it and I'll say, how you like me now? Right? That's what I would do. Next, I'm going to Herod. Oh yeah, the puppet king. You wanted me to be your monkey to do tricks for you? Well, just to let you know, buddy, I've got some tricks for you, including these brass knuckles. And then my boy, Pilate, gonna go see him. Bro, you knew I was innocent and you used your power to execute me. Well, you know what? Your story is over. This is your last day in office. Pack your bags, hit the road. The new king is here. And on your way out, tell the emperor I'm coming for him. And then lastly, gonna go see some Roman soldiers. The ones who pressed the crown of thorns into my head and mocked me and pretended that I was their king and beat me until I nearly died. That part of the story, there's no words in that part. I mean, that's what I would do if this was my story. And if Hollywood got a load of this, people would love it. Forget The Chosen. Everyone would watch that because that's a display of power. Except Jesus doesn't use the resurrection like that. Do you know what he does? You know who was on his list? You know who he sees first? His disciples. You know why? To forgive them and tell them he loved them. And to let them know that the resurrection proved that every other thing he said about the upside down kingdom was actually right side up. The cross, which was the ultimate statement of this upside down kingdom, this upside down view of power, which was the ultimate ending or exclamation point that was consistent with every other thing he had said and done. The resurrection just proved that everything else in the upside down kingdom was actually right side up, because here I am. It's better, you know why? It's better to give than to receive, because I gave my life away and now the Father has given me all authority in heaven and on earth. You know how I said that the last and the least will be first? How weak and last and empty and powerless did I look 3 days ago? And now how you like me. You know why it's true? Why you can believe that if you give your life away, that the Father will give you back everything you have given? Is because I gave my life away. And today I walked out of a grave. See, friends, the cross was not this pathetic, unexpected, undesirable, weak ending to an otherwise great story. And then the resurrection comes in and rescues it sometime. It is the ultimate act of power to show that this is what true power is. And then he doesn't stay and gloat. He doesn't then go and see all the people that would have been on my list. He doesn't stay to receive the rewards of wealth because he had been poor his whole life, or power and recognition because people had misunderstood him and people had left him and abandoned him. He just leaves. He just leaves. And he leaves his disciples to follow his example of what true leadership and true power is. And yet, somehow, it worked. He started a humility revolution. Author and researcher John Dickson was commissioned by a university in Australia to study the virtue of humility and why it is considered to be such a virtue, why it is something that we want to see in our leaders and our prime ministers and our parents and our teachers and our bosses and in our spouses and everything. And what he found was, interestingly, in Greco-Roman culture and throughout the Roman Empire, humility was not a virtue. Self-promotion was. If you wanted to be considered a good leader, a powerful leader, you promoted yourself. You talked about yourself. You took opportunities to advance yourself. Any opportunity you had to demonstrate how powerful, how important you were is what you did. It was not a sign of greatness and leadership to put others ahead of yourselves, to be humble. It was not a sign of greatness to, if you were the most powerful person in the room, to pay attention to other people, to serve other people, to give wealth away to help poor people become rich. None of those things were considered powerful. They were considered weak. They were all signs of weakness until, he says, in history, if you look at the timeline of when did it start to shift, that humility then became a powerful thing and synonymous with greatness. He said it all turned with the death of a carpenter on a Roman cross in 33 AD. And he said, then began the humility revolution. And now, he says, Sir Edmund Hillary, the first person to summit Mount Everest, one of the greatest human achievements, bears what? A cross in the top of the mountain. Now, humility is one of the things that people would say is the thing they appreciate most if they have a great boss or a great leader or a great parent or a great spouse. Now, servant leadership is one of the core pieces of cutting-edge curriculum with executives in big firms. Because Jesus has taken power and turned it on its head, and he redefined what humility is and what greatness is. And this is what Dickson's conclusion was. Humility is choosing to use your power in the service of others. According to the cross, this is true power. To take whatever power you have and use it in the service of others. This is why the cross, friends, is such a big deal in our lives. This is why it transforms all of us who are living out our own stories of power, and the way Jesus uses power and defines power and redefines his power story in light of the cross, I think meets us in two ways. And then with this, we're finished today. There are some of us who have been hurt by power. We've been on the wrong end of someone else's abuse of power. And because of that, we have sustained hurt and maybe now suspicion. Maybe we're suspicious of anyone who has power, of any position or title of authority. We're suspicious or maybe jaded even in dating relationships or marriage when it seems like the other person is trying to take advantage of us, or when we're worried that we are going to be on the wrong end of power again. Perhaps we find ourselves angry and bitter at others because of it. Or maybe we're even suspicious of God. Friends, for those of us who have been hurt by power, Jesus, the one who held his power in the service of others, invites us to come to him, to be healed by him, to know that we can trust him. He doesn't demand that we trust everyone else around us. He invites us to learn to trust him first, the one who used all of the power he had in the service of others, including you. There are some of us who have been hurt by power that Jesus invites us to come to. But then there are those of us that maybe are hungry for power. And maybe we wouldn't say it that way, but we're really focused on how do we get a little more wealth or wealth to begin with, or establish ourselves, or how do we climb the corporate ladder, or how do we get promoted, or how do we get more influence, or how do we get more opportunity, because that will just make us feel better about ourselves, or we can finally have a voice, or a voice louder than the people around us, or we will finally not be on the wrong side of power, or we will have more stability or influence in our world and in our culture, in our workplace, in our school. Perhaps we're trying to angle more to get a little more popularity or influence in our friend group. Or perhaps we're bitter and angry towards people that seem to be popular and we don't understand, or people who seem to be getting promoted ahead of us, or people who it seems like they just get more and more influence and more wealth and more platform and more power. Or perhaps we're just so addicted to or slaves to the likes and the reposts and the comments of the platform, maybe the business we're trying to build, or just ourselves that we're trying to put out there. Jesus invites us to come to him as well, to learn from him, our rabbi, a different way of holding power, a way of thinking that whatever power we have is meant to be used in the service of others. I thought, really it's only Jesus who can speak to us in that way. Those of us hurt by power, those of us hungry for power. And sometimes we're a bit of both, depending on the season we're in. And so I just want to invite you, just thought lead you in a bit of a visualization exercise where it's a prayer exercise where we bring to mind what's going on in our lives, and we come to Jesus, the crucified one, the one who rewrote the story of power for our world and for us. And so I'd invite you, if this isn't too weird for you, if you're open to it, to just close your eyes. I want you to picture kind of you at the bottom of a hill, and up on the hill, and you look and you see a cross. And you know it's Jesus' cross. And you feel compelled to walk towards it. Maybe some of us are walking there with our hurts, as we've been hurt by power. Maybe some of us are walking as we realize we've been hungry for it, or just striving for it, or upset that we aren't getting more. Either way, perhaps we're feeling powerless. As you approach the cross, just notice that it's empty. But you see Jesus sitting at the bottom of it. His legs are crossed, and he's got a very relaxed, peaceful look on his face. And he invites you to come sit with him. Notice that you're not alone. There are many others who perhaps have felt hurt by power. There are many others who are hungry for power. For those who are hungry for power, Jesus invites you to notice that there are many others with you who have been hurt by power. He wants you to remember that. And then I'd invite you simply to just ask him this question and wait for his response. Jesus, what do you want to teach me about what real power is? Jesus, what do you want to teach me about what real power is? And just wait. Listen for what he says. Jesus, we remember and recognize and are eternally grateful for how you have rewritten this story of power for us, so that you are first and foremost a safe leader and Lord. We have concrete evidence that you do not use your power to serve yourself, but to serve others. We have concrete proof that you do not crush the weak, but you use your power to lift them up. We have concrete proof that whatever riches you have, you give it to us who are poor to make us rich. And we thank you that you are our great teacher, because we have a lot to learn about our story of power. And so we ask that you would help us to rewrite it in our lives as well, so that collectively, all of us as your followers in your community would learn to use whatever power we have in the service of others. It's in your name we pray. Amen.